on this computer. Okay, take it away. Standards.
Okay, so as part of the association, John and I, we don't, they don't like us to say this, but we kind of on a little island, kind of separated from the rest of the business. Part of that is just the way it's developed, but another part of it is kind of deliberate, because we kind of want to stay away from all the stuff that's going on and then in the day-to-day kind of, this person did this person did that. John and I have to remain completely neutral, and we have to get away from all that petty stuff that might be going on the other side, with people complaining and getting into bickering and that kind of stuff. So John and I, we operate very separately. Saying that John's been around forever. I'm fairly new to the association. I've been in the industry 16 years, but I'm fairly new to the association. John's been in the industry 46 years now. So most of you guys have probably come across John. I know Michelle has used John as a resource many times, and there's no one out there who doesn't know as much about this game as John. So there's two real strings to our bow, if you like. First off, which is the bad side for all you guys, is that all the complaints from the public or all the complaints from any realtors eventually end up with John or I. So the process is that, so when someone makes a complaint, the first place that John and I go to is, okay, have the managing brokers spoken to each other about this complaint? Obviously, if it's a member of the public, we can't do that. But if it's anyone, if it's a realtor or it's a broker or it's, another realtor or broker on the other side or whatever, we try and get the managing brokers together to see if they can hash this out, because the first thing John and I want is an informal resolution. Because if we don't manage to get an informal resolution where everyone's happy, it's going to start wasting a lot of time, our time, your time, the complainant's time, the respondent's time, the managing broker's time. There's a lot of work goes involved with a complaint. That being said, that shouldn't put you off from making complaints. And, we just really need to be cognizant of the fact that once the wheels start turning and a complaint is lodged and we can't get an informal resolution, well, there's no turning back. We just keep going. Of course, a complainant can withdraw the complaint at any time. Member of the public can at any time. But typically, if we can't get through an informal resolution, it moves forward. So then the process is, we send you a document if you're a complainant. So if you're making a complaint, we send you a document, you fill in the documents, and we ask for all the relevant information that's regarding the complaint. So if it's, say, for instance, we'll just pick one off the tree. If it's a failure to disclose a multiple listing, we will look for a timeline of what you did and the respondents, and we might ask for email addresses, we might ask for text messages, anything that's relevant to the case. So once we get that information, we can then approach the managing broker who gives us the okay to then approach the respondent. The respondent then will get a form again, and then they will have their way of supplying their side of the story. The important thing to remember is John and I, we don't make decisions on anything. We are the arbiters, basically, who collect all the information, put all the information together, make sure it's a full file. So if, especially John's wonderful at this, if we go through something and, refer to this text message and the text message is not there, a thing like a text message can be the make or break of a complaint or an answer. So we go through everything kind of forensically to make sure everything lines up. We give the respondent 2 weeks to get all the details back. We get the document files from the brokerage, so from the broker. So he supplies us all, say if it's a sale, he'll supply us all the documents that have been relevant to that sale. Then we put a file together. John and I then put a summary, because what most people do is they'll send a complaint in, but they won't know what the person's done. They'll just say, oh, it doesn't look good. So, I'm complaining. So John and I then have to go through our two guiding documents, which is the Creative Code of Ethics and the Association Rules and Regulations. And we'll have to then match up the alleged behavior to something that is in these two documents. And then what we have to do is put the summary together so that when we pass the file on, whoever's taken the file off us, they'll know where to look and they'll know where the transgressions in our two guiding documents are. Once John and I have passed that on to the PCC, we are done. We are done with that file. We'll never see that file again. Then what happens is the file goes in front of the PCC, and the PCC then take the file up, and then through a whole series of either dismissing the file or having an investigation on the file, they will eventually get to a determination of where that file is. So I'm kind of cutting the PCC just a little bit short because I just wanted you to understand that where John and I come from. That is one side of our job. And another side now is we're really trying to develop the education piece. So basically, running things like this is what Michelle's asked us to come to today. Running things like online formats. I go to a lot of brokerages. We speak to anything that might be relevant or anything new legislation that's come on. You know, the multiple listing disclosure certificate, that's going to be a new rule very soon. So we're going to have a lot of incoming on that. So no doubt I'll be going to brokerages and speaking about that. And we also have just a regular email where people are just bypassing the managing broker, excuse me, not good managing brokers like Michelle, but other managing brokers out there. People just kind of bypass the managing broker and they come straight to us basically to do the managing broker's job for them. John and I have a bit of a difference of opinion on how we should handle that. My answer is, well, yeah, but have you spoken to your managing broker? Because, you know, I like to have the managing brokers getting educated. John's very much of the school of, hey, they're our members. We need to educate them. So both win. We kind of both win. If someone wants an answer, they typically go to John. If we want to get the managing broker involved, they typically come to me. But you know, we're both capable of answering anything really. Well, John especially. I'm kind of learning, and that's it. So that's pretty much what John and I do on a day-to-day basis. Anyone, any questions about process or what we do, or how old is John? Could 46 years of industry experience.
No, it's great.
We're good. Okay. Thanks, Michelle. So John will take us up now on the defects.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk about material latent defects and how to deal with them for you today. That's the request, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody can see my screen now.
Yeah.
The only person who can't see everything properly is me. Okay, there we go. I got it all organized, I think. Okay, so patent defects, we'll start with that. What are they and how they differ from material latent defects? And we'll move through this and then have an opportunity for questions. A defect that is discoverable by reasonable inspection or inquiry. So this is what building inspectors do. This is what people do when they look at a house. If they see defects, you know, they're discoverable. Some examples of this are cracked windows, sloping floors, uneven pavement or sidewalk, so concrete that's sloping and that sort of stuff, cracked basement floor, cracked drywall in ceiling or walls. All of these are patent defects. The obligation to disclose a patent defect, well, there really is no obligation to disclose it, regardless if the buyer had an inspection or not. It is a buyer beware jurisdiction in which you operate. And so there's no obligation to disclose the obvious kind of defects in a home. Latent defects, this is different than patent defects. This is a defect that cannot be discerned. It's hidden or not readily apparent through reasonable inspection of premises that renders the premises dangerous or potentially dangerous to occupants or unfit for habitation. These kind of things, well, I'll give you some examples. So here's some examples. An illegal suite. Okay, there's been a lot of changes to legislation and whatnot, and a lot of talk about secondary accommodation. It's important to understand that this change, these changes to legislation, which come into effect, I think, in June of this year, do not make illegal suites legal. It makes it so cities must allow legal suites to be built in single-family homes. And they can't put barriers like off-street parking and things like that to it. They have to allow them if somebody wants to do it. So an illegal suite, work done without a permit, that is a latent defect. And it needs to be disclosed one way, shape, form, or another. Underground sewer lines infiltrated with tree roots, and the seller had experienced sewer backups previously. So that's an issue. And that's something that, you know, conversations with sellers, they should disclose that to you. If you don't know and they don't disclose, well, you know, then there's no obligation to disclose. You can't disclose what you don't know. But you should be asking questions and they should be answering them, hopefully, honestly. Other renovations done without permits, you would be surprised at how many times new homeowners phone me and ask, or phone us and ask about, how did this happen that I bought a house and there was no permits for the sun deck or no permits for the suite? They told me it was a legal suite. It happens with frequency, I'll put it that way. And sometimes on $1 million homes, there was a home that owners, $1.4 million they paid for it. 2 weeks later, so imagine, 2 weeks later, the bylaw officer shows up at the front door and says, hi, I'm the bylaw officer, and I've been advised that you have an illegal suite in your home. And they say, nope, I have a nanny suite. It's not illegal. And the inspector says, well, I have to look at it. Let me in, please. And they do. And they go downstairs, and it has cooking facilities. The municipality made them remove the stove, pull the 220 wiring out, take out permits for the other work that required permits, like plumbing and that sort of thing downstairs, and had to take the range hood out as well. And that meant cutting holes in walls and things like that. On $1.4 million, I think it cost them $1,200. And it happened in the first 2 weeks. I don't know what these people could have done to inspire such a call to the municipality, but maybe the neighbors just didn't like having the suite there and wouldn't rat out their old friends or whatever. I don't know how it happened, but not a nice housewarming gift. Undisclosed capital cost assessment, sewer lines. You know, this is about the taxes and that sort of thing. That's reasonably easy information to get, but it is an example of something that cannot be discerned through an inspection. Presence of mold or insects entrenched in the home. Environmental concerns. You know, and this is contaminated soil, gas station nearby. Sometimes that's an issue. We had one recently in Revelstoke, a fueling station for larger vehicles was across the street from a new development, and there was concerns about potential pollution contamination to the soil, and it had to get dealt with. Latent defects, some important differences between these kind of different defects. Latent defects fall under common law. So this is where a seller makes their disclosure on the PDS. Okay, so the property disclosure statement has a place for latent defects, and sometimes they will include what are known as material latent defects as well. They're disclosed by the seller through the PDS, and that is the seller's disclosure, and it is not the real estate agent's disclosure. Material latent defects are essentially the same but broader and a requirement under the Real Estate Services Act, and of course you are responsible to comply with RESA. And that's why this obligation about material defects, the disclosure of them, fall to you and not the owner. This is the responsibility that is different from the seller's obligation. So material latent defects, the difference. In its simplest form, material means major and latent means hidden. So material latent defect is a major hidden defect related to a piece of real estate. If a property has a defect that cannot be discovered with reasonable care during an inspection, this is a latent defect. A material latent defect is a defect that a reasonable person would agree is significant in the particular circumstances of a transaction, and it can't be discovered. So a defect that is not discoverable by reasonable inspection or inquiry and makes the property dangerous or uninhabitable or unfit for the purpose for which a party is acquiring, including risk to health. Mold is a good example of that. A defect that would involve, this is from the Real Estate Services Act, a defect that would involve great expense to remedy, notice of non-compliance by local government, and lack of permits. And then we're back, lack of permits, you're back again to illegal suites and things like sun decks being rebuilt without permits and that sort of stuff. So here's some examples. There's quite a few of them here. Illegal suite, and there we go right off the top. Underground sewer lines, again, infiltrated with tree roots. But you have to know that this happened. You can't disclose what you don't know. However, I can tell you that agents in my office in the Lower Mainland were sued over this very issue. And they, for some reason, well, I know the reason. The buyers liked the buyer's agent, so they didn't include the buyer's agent. But the judge, when it went to court, there is the buyer, a young married couple, and they're in court with 2 of their children, and she is 7 months pregnant. And so they make great sympathy items for judges to consider. And he starts building his case. He's representing himself in small claims court, suing us for $8,000. And he's suing the building inspector. And so we look, and the seller and the real estate agents. So at 11:45, the judge stops the buyer and says, are you just about done? And he says, no, I've got lots more to go. And the judge looked over at the defendant's side and said, I see 2 real estate agents, and I see a managing broker, and I see their lawyer, and I see the seller's representative and their lawyer, and I see the building inspector and their lawyer. I would hazard a guess that your time spent here today and prior to this has exceeded the amount that you're being sued for. So I strongly recommend that we're going to break for lunch now. And when we come back at 1, I expect to have a resolution presented to me. And so they went for lunch, and the lawyers huddled and said, you heard the judge, you got to pay. So they settled it right then and there. And I think they settled it for $6,000. But the realtors weren't happy that they had to settle, but E&O said, no, settle it. And because then you lose your coverage if you don't settle when they recommend it. So an interesting little story. Other renovations done without permits. This is sun decks and things like that. Any kind of work that requires permits. Sewer line assessment and that sort of thing. If you've got the information and it's disclosed in a PDS and it's covered, even though it covers these items, they don't need to be redisclosed again if the PDS is signed prior to acceptance of an offer. There's the environmental concerns again, gas station abandoned buried oil tanks. I had a client who successfully sued the seller and the listing agent and had an oil tank removed and the soil remeted to the tune of $45,000, I think, in a South Vancouver home. Strata property, a structural problem with common property building. If you know about it, you got to disclose it. It's interesting. Archaeological claims, and this has to do with the Heritage Act, and this has to do with the Indigenous people. And it's especially important, especially in the rural areas around Vernon and some of the lakefront properties all through the Okanagan, or properties that may have been used by Indigenous people to get to fishing places and things like that on the Shuswap River and stuff like that. Well, if the land is going to be redeveloped, you need to look into this. And when I say redeveloped, a good example is a lot that was sold up on Maple Lake recently in that area. It wasn't on the lake, but it was sold in that area. And when the building, the guy who bought it was a builder and he applied for a permit, had to go through the archaeological claims process and whatnot. Very complicated, very long, very secretive, challenging. You sell a ranch, and if they're going to add new buildings and things like that, that can come into play as well, even though the land has been there and run as a ranch for years and years and years. Presence of radon, you see that in the PDS. Interesting, second leading cause of lung cancer in Canada. And radon affects homes everywhere, not just in the Okanagan. Water ingress that reoccurs. I actually had this happen on a listing of mine. Every spring, there would be a little flow of water that would appear at the back of the house and go through the crawl space and come out the front of the house. Never did any damage, but it was there. You could see the high water marks and everything. We disclosed that as a material latent defect, not easily discoverable. It could have been discovered, but not easily. No lights down in the crawl space and that sort of thing. Those are some good examples. The obligation to disclose, if the seller instructs you not disclose such a defect, or if you discover such a defect, you must take steps to ensure that the sellers will let you make the disclosure. If the seller will not allow disclosure, advise them to get legal advice, then have another discussion with them. And if they still tell you not to disclose, you're taking on huge risk. And according to Teresa, you must walk away. This applies to foreclosures, even though they are being sold as is, where is. The fact that they are being sold as is, where is does not absolve you of your obligation to make a disclosure of a material latent defect that you're aware of. How do you disclose these? Yes.
Sorry, Rob here. Just wanted to ask a question about disclosing suites.
Yeah.
So I've had clients tell me that they don't want their illegal suite marketed. So when we list our listings, it's required to tick off yes or no for suite, but it's not required to tick off if it's illegal or not. So that's just how we enter them in our matrix.
Yeah.
I've had clients tell me they don't want it marketed as a suite out of fear that through some marketing somehow the municipality will see this and audit them.
Yeah.
What would you say to an agent? I guess a couple things. How do we define suite, whether it's legal or illegal? I guess legal is a moot point. Someone would want that advertised. That's just fine. But if it's illegal, what kind of advice would you have for an agent where their clients are saying, I don't want you disclosing it as a suite?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that question. One is the real world question answer, and one is the compliant answer. The answer to your question, if it has an illegal suite, is it is a material latent defect. Okay, and it's not easy. It's not something that is easily repaired. Like an illegal suite, to have a suite that's legal in a basement of a home, you need to have separate heating facilities for upstairs and downstairs. So it can't run by the thermostat on the main floor. It needs to be completely separate. You also need to have extra fire stop between the suite and the main floor, which means closing off the furnace ducts so that the fire can't go along the furnace ducts. So these are expensive items. You got to have double drywall in the ceiling, right? And in order to, and those are just the basics to get to an illegal suite, forget about access and egress and that sort of thing. So what can I say? You're supposed to disclose it. There's the rules. Okay, there's the regulation under RISA. There is the obligation. I'm going to get to it about our rules in this presentation as well. But having said that, salespeople make risk-benefit analyses all the time, right? And nobody likes to
Rich?
I'm sorry? Okay, so people don't like to walk away, and I understand there's money on the table, and the reality is that it almost never becomes a problem. To give you an example, when these people, I've had two of them this year, about people phoning me and talking about the cost of having to remedy these work done without permits and that sort of stuff, right? I've had two of them this year, and the buyers are really upset. They're going to cost these people money. And then I explained the process to them about filing a complaint against us. And they said, well, that's nuts. I'm not going to do that. And then when I explained the process at the regulator's office, that it's going to take 3 to 5 years, they say, I just want to get on with life. And I said, well, then your only other recourse is to take them to court. Oh, I don't want to sue anybody. It's such a hassle. It costs so much and whatnot. So the reality is, there's your answer. You can make a risk benefit analysis and decide to proceed. The risk is low, in my opinion. Doesn't happen very often, but if you do get caught, you're going to end up in two places, probably. At the regulator's office, answering to a complaint. You might end up at all three at the same time. The regulator's office, answering for a complaint, a complaint can be filed with us and at the same time, and it will be processed in the same time. And you can be sued in a court of law, all at the same time, for failing to make proper disclosure over an illegal suite. I had an agent in my office in Kelowna, he was acting for a buyer, brand new house with a suite in it. It was illegal. And they never made disclosure. The offer was accepted, and the agent and the seller happened to be a lawyer. And the agent discovered that the suite was illegal after the offer had been accepted. And that owner was required before completion date to remove and get proper permits for all the work that was done in the basement without a permit, remove the cooking supplies and everything else because you couldn't make it legal because there wasn't off-street parking. And I can't remember what it cost, but it was a significant sum of money. And it was a lawyer who was doing it, and they were made to pay the price. So there's the answer, the best answer I can give you, okay? It's long, but the reality is the reality, right?
Would it be more of a lawyer question to ask, what is the definition of an illegal suite?
No, I don't think, well, yeah, it would be, I think an illegal suite is accommodation that is in a home that was done without permits and does not have city approval. So there's bylaw requirements, like I can't speak for Vernon, but in Kelowna, they want a certain amount of off-street parking. They have very specific rules and regulations around that. And they require it to be compliant with the BC Building Code and how the building code is enforced. And that's a really interesting point, because the building code can be enforced differently in West Kelowna than it is in Kelowna and Vernon. But having said that, illegal suites are pretty clear. If you've got cooking facilities like a stove and you've got a kitchen downstairs, and that would be considered to be the start of an illegal suite. And if it's ever used as a rental, if it's not being used, even then, it's still an illegal suite. That one I told you about, the $1.4 million, they had to take out the cooking facilities, even though it wasn't rented out.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. So written disclosures are required for material latent defect. The PDS can be used if the disclosure that the seller makes includes the material latent defect. But if without that, you need to disclose it in writing. And there is a form in the BC, I think it's BCFSA directory. It might be in both, but it's not a mandatory form. It's a material latent defect form. It's in the BCREA directory for sure. You don't need to use it. You can disclose it on an ordinary piece of paper. Just make the details in there. And it must be disclosed in writing before the contract of purchase and sale is accepted. The PDS can be used for this disclosure, but it's got to be signed by the buyers prior to acceptance of the offer. And most buyers don't like to do that. They like an opportunity to peruse a PDS, and it has to include the material latent defect, the PDS, not just the common law disclosure required by a seller in order to be used. And if you're not using the PDS, you need to use a written form, and you must insert the clause, the following clause, well, must, I say must. Okay, RISA says you need to put this clause in. The buyer acknowledges having received a seller's separate disclosure of material latent defects dated such and such, relating to whatever the issue is. And this is to prevent fraud. This is to ensure that a mortgage company or lender knows that what they're buying has some material latent defect, and so that they lend on the basis of that. So why is it important to disclose this stuff? Well, and why is it done before acceptance of an offer? Well, it's any item or concept that can alter after a seller or buyer's decision, alter a seller or a buyer's decision in a transaction, mostly the buyer. So the buyers see these kind of defects as potentially costly, and they might not offer as much money and it can affect the value of the property. And the idea of making disclosure ahead of time is to take some of the emotion out of it and let a buyer know, have an informed picture of what they're buying. That's the important part of this. So best practices. So if an agent goes to court and a judge asks what industry best practice is, and the agent has not done that, it will not be good for the agent. And oftentimes lawyers look for experts in the real estate field to provide testimony. That's where they'll ask the expert, what is the expected practice that a real estate agent should do? And they're going to say, you got to disclose because that's the regulation. And you got to disclose in writing prior to acceptance of the offer. Include material latent defect form in supplements. Best surprise is no surprise. And then you don't forget, well, it's there. And you still have an obligation to make sure that it is signed ahead of time. Okay, prior to acceptance of the offer. Having it in the document folder is not going far enough. You need to make sure that it is signed prior to acceptance. And here's a couple of rules. This is unauthorized accommodation. We have a rule about this, okay? So listings of property containing unauthorized suites will be acceptable on the MLS system when noted in the realtor remarks that property contains accommodation which is not authorized. You're supposed to put these words in the realtor remarks. Now you got to remember that those words, the realtor remarks, do not flow to realtor.ca or any reciprocity website, so the public never sees them. Just because they're there in our rules and they're there, that doesn't mean that you don't have to make a further disclosure. Listings of property where there is an unauthorized use will be acceptable when noted in the realtor remarks that property has a use that is not authorized. So this covers other things than just illegal suites. I don't know what they might be, but I don't have any examples, but that's what the rule says. This rule does not mean that you do not have to properly disclose the material latent defect. You still have to make that disclosure. Code of Ethics, Article 4, Discovery of Facts. A realtor has an obligation to discover facts pertaining to a property, which a prudent realtor would discover in order to avoid error or misrepresentation. So, you all know about city files and freedom of information requests in Vernon and that sort of thing. That's where you're going to find out if there was a permit taken out for a suite. They will need a permit for a suite. If there's no permit and there's a suite and there's cooking facilities downstairs, you can de facto call it an illegal suite or unauthorized accommodation. Few odds and ends to be aware of. Remarks both realtor and public need to be very careful as to what stones will be uncovered as a result of information disclosed. In slower times, municipalities actually instruct their employees to review ads. And when you run an ad for a property and it has an illegal suite in it and you call it a suite, they can check the records and they will go after the sellers. Been known to happen in Kelowna. That's something that happens in Coldstream. Even still today, the Coldstream is a perfect example of this new legislation not making old illegal suites legal. They will still come after them if they're not legal. CRA income claims, you never know if people are claiming rental income from a suite or not. And if you put this out to the public, it may come to the attention of CRA. City file, negligent or fraudulent misrepresentation. There's the city agents looking around for this stuff. Suites, legal, nanny, summer kitchen. Those are terms that realtors use seemingly interchangingly. A nanny suite would be a suite that does not have cooking facilities. A summer kitchen is an interesting concept because a summer kitchen, it's not designed for accommodation. I don't know where the city draws the line on the difference between a summer kitchen and an illegal suite. Summer kitchen probably does not, they still not allow cooking appliances like a stove. Additions to property, porches, enclosed patios, sun decks have already been mentioned. There you go. I'm gonna leave it open for questions. How are we doing for time?
Doing great.
Okay, so now I'm going to see if I can get back and stop my sharing on my screen. It's always the problem with this presentations.
Anybody on Zoom have questions?
No questions?
I'm gonna ask them about, is in-law suite the same thing?
Which?
Like, is it acceptable? Like, yeah, it's a nanny suite, is it one of the?
Like, what's the wording we should use?
Yeah,
Well, in,
because in-law suite is quite commonly used too.
yeah, so the question is, the word in-law suite is used often. So we're
Yeah.
not claiming anything to be legal.
No, but it may trigger something. Okay, so it's an interesting question, right? It is, a nanny suite is one that does not have cooking facilities. And would it trigger an investigation from the city? Perhaps, perhaps not. If you're clear about it and you use that, but you can't use that term to describe an illegal suite. Okay, that's a misrepresentation. So you're obligated to properly represent the property, discover the facts. If it's an illegal suite, it's still an illegal suite. What you know, no matter what you call it. You remember my presentation a while ago, Mike, where I used a picture of a pig and asked people if it was a horse? It is the same thing. It's an illegal suite, and just by calling it something different doesn't make it different. It's still an illegal suite.
Yeah, what are the ramifications of a rental suite that was never claimed with the CRA for income for a seller or buyer?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but essentially running a suite in your home, you're setting up a rental business. That's how CRA probably would view it. And you could be charged, you may have to amend previous income tax returns to reflect this money, that, and that may even constitute fraud. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but that would be my take on CRA. And this has sort of been brought to light a little bit with the legislation around short-term rentals and whatnot, and how that is running a business and deemed to be a business and that sort of thing as well. So
have you seen that previously, that's happened to somebody selling or buying?
I have no firsthand knowledge of it happening to somebody, but I've heard stories about owners not declaring rental income and being caught. You got to remember that somebody's declaring that as their principal residence downstairs too. So it's easy for CRA to cross-check things by address. They got a pretty good database, I think, and they can look things up. But yeah, I think that's a very real possibility, and it is a risk that you do not want to take on, in my personal opinion. You know, like if you're seen to be the cause of this coming and affecting the seller, you may have yourself a little bit of a problem. Mind you, you have insurance for that sort of thing. You got any questions about anything else going on in your industry right now? One of the hot topics these days is other agents doing open houses and that sort of thing. Do you have any questions around that? Are you satisfied that you know what's going on, that sort of stuff?
I think
Multiple
Allison has a great question to ask.
What's that?
Yeah, put me on the spot. I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but I did have a listing, and if it's considered suite potential and there's no stove, but everything else and it's rented, but they use like a hot plate, is that still considered illegal?
That would be what I would call unauthorized accommodation. Okay, there's an example of unauthorized accommodation. It's not a silly question. It's a good question, actually. And that's an example of somebody living in an accommodation that is not authorized. Okay, and so it would be, yes, it would be clearly, in my mind, illegal, however you call it, unauthorized or illegal. And using a hot plate down there, it is still, somebody's living there. That would be the way that it could work, that you are not using it, having it as unauthorized accommodation or an illegal suite, is if somebody had access to the kitchen upstairs. So then you become a boarder. So the tenant moves in, they're no longer a tenant, they're a boarder, and they have access to common space they share common space with the owner of the property. They go up and they can cook their meals in the kitchen and come downstairs and eat them and that sort of thing. And now you're a boarder. And if it's a nanny suite, you don't have the cooking appliances downstairs, you share this common area. And that would be the difference, okay? So your in-laws or your mother or your father living in a suite in the basement, and they're not paying rent, or it's very modest rent, and they're sharing cooking facilities upstairs, that would not be, in my opinion, unauthorized accommodation.
Thank you.
We have one more question. If you have an illegal suite and there's fear from the sellers again that it might get flagged with the city, if you disclose it in the PDS, but not on the MLS, like not on your listing, is that sufficient?
Well, okay, so no, it's not quite sufficient. Okay, so you need to disclose it in the realtor remarks, and that's why disclosing it in the realtor remarks, there's a potential problem with it, but mostly this is why you're not supposed to use the full version for a listing information sheet to give to your buyer clients. You
Right.
give them the buyer option. The realtor remarks do not appear in that document. And the realtor remarks do not flow to realtor.ca, and they do not flow to other reciprocity websites. That data is restricted for member use only, and it stays there. And that's why you have those different types of forms. So you're supposed to, according to our rules, disclose this to the other members in the realtor remarks, and the buyers should not be seeing that. Now, they might see it while you're sharing a computer screen, but when you print versions, you don't give them the full version. You don't give them a realtor version, you give them the public version, and away you go with that. And so you'd still be required to put it in the realtor remarks.
Okay.
And that's it. You know, the interesting point about that question is that you need to be able to clarify that with your seller. Okay, so if they don't want to disclose it, well, you can tell them, look, we got to put it in there. That's an MLS rule. We can't amend the rules. We can't amend the listing. We're required to abide by the rules, but rest assured that this won't, well, can't say it won't 100% accuracy and not get in the hands of the public, but it won't be in the public domain broadly on the internet and places like that, because that data just won't flow. But a buyer may actually be given a copy. We've probably all given out full copies to some clients in the past.
I have a bit of an off-topic question just because I was asked it today and it was on my list to ask you or Michael. Agents accompanying home inspectors, accompanying the buyers for the home inspection.
Yeah.
We had a realtor from Vancouver represent the buyer. Our listing agent said, you know, are you going to be there for the home inspection? He said, well, no, I'm in Vancouver. I think that's 7.45 that says, and the buyers must be accompanied by a licensee. That's the rule that would apply, right? It's not something specific to home inspectors. I thought there was something specific to home inspectors being accompanied.
No, it's not the home inspector that
buyers.
needs to be
The
accompanied at
buyers.
all. It's so the rule,
7.45, I'm sure.
okay, so the rule is appointments. That's the
Yes,
name
yeah.
of the rule. It's appointments, and you're correct. So that you don't have to accompany a building inspector, but a licensee has to be present whenever the buyers are present. Okay,
Yeah.
so it could be by way of agreement with the listing agent showing up. If the buyer's agent is busy or away or whatever, or from Vancouver and can't make it, well, that's fine. If you want to attend as the listing agent, you can, but a licensee has to be there. You know, and the building inspectors have advised us that in the majority of cases, licensees don't attend. And, you know, I get it, but there's, you know, this thing about people not willing to file complaints. And we can't do anything to anybody or try to seek compliance or even educate people about this innocuous little rule that requires licensees to be present unless we get a complaint. And so it leads to people more and more abuse, right? But you're absolutely correct. And it's usually for the last half hour or 40 minutes. The other thing about building inspectors, this is just a little sidebar to your question. So some building inspectors pay money every month to be have a contract with the association, and they get access to lockboxes, and they don't need a one-day code. And other building inspectors don't. And if a buyer hires a building inspector that doesn't have access to lockboxes and can't open them, they're going to require a one-day code in all likelihood, because the buyer's agent does not want to go there and open up the house. Neither does the listing agent. But our rule prohibits giving out a one-day code to anybody other than a licensed realtor. And you need to know those people as well, the other realtors, unless authorized by the seller in writing. So if I hired Mike to be my building inspector and I'm the buyer, and I phone you, Michelle, and say, look, I've hired Mike, and you ask me a couple of questions about Mike, and you say, well, he doesn't have access to the lockboxes. Well, okay, I get it. He doesn't have access to lockboxes, but he's my building inspector. So you need to try to facilitate my request as the buyer. You have to follow my instructions. I've hired Mike, get him in the house. So you phone the listing agent, you say, look, Mike doesn't have access to the lockboxes. He's the building inspector my buyer's bought. Can you provide us with a one-day code? And some people interpret that rule as saying, they just say, no, I'm not giving you a one-day code. The rule says I can't do it. But that's not really what the rule says. It says unless otherwise instructed by the seller, and they must take steps to facilitate this request. Now, the seller is the ultimate decider. If they go and ask the seller and the seller says, no, I'm not giving you the one-day code. Okay, no one-day code. How is the building inspector going to get in? Well, the buyer's agent then needs to go and open up that lockbox and allow them access. And they don't have to stay, or another licensee could do it. They don't have to stay the whole time for the inspection, but they need to get them into that house because the buyer has requested that building inspector be hired. And then they need to show up at the end and be there if the buyers have been invited, or to make sure that the property is secured, because they're the ones, even if the buyers are not going to be there, they need to make sure that property was secured properly.
That's a great reminder. And then circling back to the appointments, could you get the seller's written consent that the buyers, say the listing agent's like, I'm busy, I can't go, and the listing agent can't come and the buyer's agent can't come? Could we get in writing from the sellers that it's okay that they be there with the home inspector, not accompanied by a licensee?
Okay, so this is where you need to know what the rules say, and there are 11 different spots in our some 78 rules, not counting the Code of Ethics, that allow for written instructions from the seller to be obtained. Unfortunately, that rule, appointments, does not have that built into it. Those magic 8 words do not appear there unless otherwise instructed by the seller. So you must comply with our rules. The multiple listing agreement has a sentence in it that says that the listing agent only has to accept instructions from the seller that are compliant with RISA and the regulator and the regulations of RISA, the Code of Ethics, and the MLS rules of the association. So you must, you cannot get written instructions to avoid that obligation. A licensee is supposed to be there.
Perfect. Thank you. Anything else, guys? Yeah.
Very helpful.
Super helpful.
Okay, no questions around multiple offers? Or no questions around the new multiple offer? I'm just.
Oh yeah, well, we did a session on that, but we'll take another one later.
Okay.
Because Krista took your training, so she regurgitated it to the group.
Oh yeah. Okay, well, just so you know, for multiple offers, the form that was created, the multiple offer disclosure form that was created, was a copy of that form obtained from Vancouver Real Estate Board in late September last year, and it was approved by the Board of Directors and the Governance Committee in October for use here. And as was the rule change that required the use of that form in the disclosure of the multiple offers. That rule was approved, but it has not been published yet. And that is because of all the recent fear that led to the issues in the special meetings and that sort of thing about getting board of director members to resign and that sort of thing. And it used up all the resources and it never did get published. It's my understanding that those rule changes are going to be published soon. I'm not sure when, but you can watch for them. And then at that point in time, the form will become mandatory to be used. It's not mandatory right now, but that form is also subject to change. Because the Vancouver Real Estate Board, Fraser Valley, Chilliwack, Paul River, BC Northern, Vancouver Island and Victoria all use a slightly different version of that form. And that slightly different version no longer has spaces for the buyers to sign. So that is before the governance committee is going before the governance committee and then to the board for approval. Whether or not it will be approved, I don't know. There's rationale for having the buyers sign it, and there's rationale for not requiring the buyer's signature. After all, it is just a disclosure, and it is a seller disclosure. It's not contractual in any way. So I don't know what will happen. The form is subject to change, so watch for that as well. I don't know the timelines, but those are coming sometime soon.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Okay, oh,
You can go ahead and make sure everybody who attended applies for their 1 day or their self-directed credits for the hour-long presentation. Okay, and have a good day, everybody. Glad to have been
Okay,
here.
thanks. I'll put in your PDP for you guys. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.